I always thought that if I could just get away from the noise, the traffic, and the constant back and forth of the city, I'd finally find some peace, and man, I really thought I'd found it in this little place out near Blackwood Creek. Just a modest cabin, a real fixer-upper tucked between a wall of ancient pines and a river that sounded like heavy silk tearing all night long. I'd spent every cent of my savings on that land because I wanted a world where the only thing I had to answer to was the weather, and for exactly 2 weeks, it was heaven. Just me, some sandpaper, and a gallon of wood stain. Until the morning, I walked out to my porch and found a letter waiting for me that smelled like a department store perfume counter and was wrapped in a shade of pink, so bright it practically vibrated against the dark cedar of my railing. I opened it up, expecting a welcome note from a neighbor or maybe a flyer for a local hardware store. But instead, I was staring at a bill for $20,000 in quote, overdue membership fees and environmental maintenance surcharges in quote, from something called the Silver Leaf Estates Homeowners Association. I just stood there for a second, blinking against the sun, wondering if I'd accidentally stepped into some kind of alternate reality because, see, the whole reason I bought this specific patch of dirt was that it was on county land, free and clear, no HOA, no restrictive covenants, and definitely no pastel color ransom notes. I checked the maps twice, my realtor had confirmed it, and the deed was as clean as a whistle. But according to this letter, I was 7 years behind on my quote, civic obligations quote, to a community I didn't even belong to. I figured it was just a clerical error, a simple mix-up that a quick conversation would fix, so I didn't oppose. To even get mad, I just tucked the letter into my pocket and started walking down my gravel driveway to where the county road begins. About 300 yards down, there's this massive, ornate stone pillar with a gold leaf sign that says, "Welcome to Silver Leaf Estates," a prestigious planned community, and that's where their jurisdiction ends and my wilderness begins. Or at least that's what the law said. I was standing there, looking at the invisible line in the dirt, when this electric golf cart came whirring up the path like a silent predator, driven by a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of a very expensive, very bitter lemon. She didn't oppose to even wait for the cart to fully stop before she stepped out, clutching a leather-bound clipboard to her chest like it was a holy relic, as she looked me up and down with this expression that made me feel like I was a particularly ugly stain on her favorite rug. End quote. "You must be Elias, the new resident at the Creek property," end quote, she said, her voice dripping with that kind of manufactured sweetness that usually precedes a lawsuit, end quote. "I'm Margaret Vane, the president of the Silver Leaf Board, and I noticed you haven and oppose. T responded to our electronic portal invite yet." End quote. I just looked at her, tried to keep my voice steady, and said, end quote, "Look, Margaret, they're in oppose. That's been a mistake. I'm not in Silver Leaf. My property is past the pillar, and oppose. S county zoned. So I think your system just flagged me by accident." End quote. She let out this little, sharp laugh that didn't oppose. T reached her eyes at all and flipped through her papers until she found a photocopy of a document that looked like it had been through a washing machine, pointing to a smudge at the bottom that was supposed to be a signature. End quote. "Mr. Miller, the previous owner, signed a voluntary annexation agreement 6 years ago when we provided emergency snow removal services to his road," end quote. She said, her eyes narrowing behind her designer sunglasses, end quote. "And since that agreement runs with the land, you are now a member in arrears. The $22,000 is actually us being generous, as we haven and oppose. T factored in the daily interest for the first 3 years yet," end quote. I stared at that smudge on the paper. It wasn't an oppose. T notarized, it wasn't an oppose. T stamped by the county recorder, and it sure as hell didn't an oppose. T looked like the neat, shaky handwriting of the old man who'd sold me the place. And I realized right then that I wasn't an oppose. T dealing with a mistake. I was dealing with a predator who had spent years bullying people who didn't an oppose. T know their rights. I told her flat out that I wasn't an oppose. T paying a dime, and that she was trespassing on my driveway. And she just smiled, this cold, thin-lipped thing, and said, quote, "We'll see how you feel when the lien hits your title, Elias. Silver Leaf doesn't an oppose. T take kindly to people who enjoy our and oppose, aesthetic value and oppose, without contributing to the upkeep." End quote. She whirred away in her little cart, and I stood there in the dust, the piece of the river suddenly feeling very far away, replaced by this cold knot of anger in my stomach that told me my renovation project was about to involve a lot more than just plumbing and paint. I spent the next 3 days at the county courthouse, digging through records that smelled like damp basements and old ink, and the more I dug, the more I realized Margaret Vane wasn't into oppos. Just a nosy neighbor. She was a ghost hunter, searching for old, forgotten paperwork to, annex, anyone who lived on the borders of her precious estate. The clerk, a guy named Dave who looked like he'd seen every land dispute since the gold rush, just shook his head when I showed him Margaret's, contract, She's been trying to grab that river frontage for a decade, Dave told me, leaning over the counter and lowering his voice, She wants the HOA to control the water access so they can build a private pier, but the county won in oppos. Give it to her, so she's been trying to bankrupt the independent owners one by one until they sell to her friends on the board, He told me about a couple, the Hendersons, who lived just a mile up from me and ended up moving out after Margaret sued them over the color of their barn, claiming it lowered the, perceived value, of the estates, even though you couldn't in oppos even see the barn from her side of the fence. I felt this surge of adrenaline, that kind of, oh, so that's how we're playing, feeling, and I started reaching out to the names Dave mentioned, finding this hidden network of people who had been living in the shadow of Margaret's ego for years, too scared or too tired to fight back. I met a woman named Sarah at a diner in town. She was a nurse, worked double shifts, and she told me with tears in her eyes how she'd paid $4,000 in, landscape violations, just to keep the HOA from putting a lien on her house while she was trying to refinance. She showed me her receipts, and they were all signed by the same person, Margaret's husband, who just happened to be the treasurer of the Silver Leaf Board. It was a family business, a sophisticated shakedown disguised as community service, and I knew that if I just fought my own bill, Margaret would just move on to the next person. So I started collecting everything. The fake contracts, the inconsistent maps, the testimonies for people like Sarah who had been bled dry by a woman in a golf cart. But then, things got ugly. I'd be working on my porch at night and see headlights idling at the end of my drive, just watching me, or I'd wake up to find, notice of violation, stickers plastered all over my windows for things like, unauthorized construction noise, at 10 in the morning. One night, someone actually threw a rock through my kitchen window with a note wrapped around it that said, "Pay your dues or lose your views." And that was the moment the gloves came off because you dawn into oppos. Come into a man's home and threaten his safety over a fake membership fee. I didn't into oppos. Called the police right away because I knew Margaret had friends on the local council. So instead, I called a guy I'd gone to school with who specialized in forensic accounting and digital mapping, and we spent a week overlaying the HOAs official maps with the actual satellite data from the state. What we found was even worse than I imagined. Margaret hadn't into oppos. Just been extending the borders. She'd been double billing the county for road maintenance that the HOA was claiming to do, essentially stealing tax dollars while shaking down the residents for the same work. I organized a secret meeting in my cabin, the Blackwood Creek Rebellion, we called it, and invited 12 families who were all being targeted by the Silver Leaf Board, and we sat there in the dim light of my unfinished living room, passing around folders of evidence while the river roared outside. We decided to wait until the Silver Leaf annual general meeting, the one night a year where Margaret liked to stand on a stage in the community center and talk about, vision, and prestige, and when that night came, I didn't in oppos. Go in with a lawyer or a police officer. I went in with a projector and a megaphone. The room was full of wealthy homeowners who thought their dues were going toward flowers and security, and Margaret was right in the middle of a speech about, protecting our borders from the unrefined elements of the creek, when I walked down the center aisle. Margaret, I think you dropped something, I said, my voice echoing in the hall, and I clicked the remote in my hand, projecting the forensic map onto the big white wall behind her, showing the red lines of the HOA and oppos, actual territory, and the blue lines of the land she'd been illegally taxing. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy in your ears, as I flipped to the next slide, showing the check Sarah and the Hendersons had written, compared to the HOA and OPPOs. Bank statements that didn't and OPPOs. T show a single cent of that money being deposited into the community fund. Margaret's face turned a shade of white I've only ever seen on a fish belly, and she started screaming about, in quote, order, in quote, and in quote, security, in quote. But the people in the seats, the ones who actually lived in Silverleaf, started standing up, realizing that their own dues had been subsidizing a private slush fund for Margaret's home renovations and her husband's, in quote, consulting, in quote, fees. I handed the microphone to Sarah, and she told her story, her voice shaking but clear, and by the time she was done, the police I'd called 10 minutes earlier were walking through the back doors. The fallout was like a dam breaking. Once the first lie was exposed, the whole structure just crumbled, and within a month, the state attorney general had opened a fraud investigation that ended up clawing back nearly $600,000 in embezzled funds and illegal fines. Margaret and her husband didn't and oppose. Just lose their positions on the board. They lost their house to cover the restitution, and the irony of her being evicted for failing to pay her own legal debts was a flavor of justice that I'll be savoring for the rest of my life. The Silverleaf HOA didn't and oppose. Survived the scandal. The residents voted to dissolve it entirely, realizing they didn't and oppose. Need a board of directors to tell them what color to paint their front doors or how tall their grass should be. And now, when I walk down to that stone pillar at the end of my drive, the gold leaf sign is gone, replaced by a simple wooden board that says respect the creek, love thy neighbor. My cabin is finished now. The wood is stained a deep, honest brown, and the river is the only thing I hear at night, but I still keep that pink letter framed in my hallway as a reminder that, in quote, peace, in quote, I ascend in oppos. Something you just buy with a deed. In oppos, as something you have to be willing to defend when the bullies come whirring up your driveway in their golf carts. But you know, it makes me wonder how many of us are sitting in homes right now, paying, in quote, fees, in quote, and following, in quote, rules, in quote, just because someone with a clipboard told us we had to, without ever stopping to ask if they actually have the right to hold the pen? Is it really about the community, or is it just about who's got the loudest voice and the most official-looking letterhead? I'd love to hear if any of you have had to draw a line in the dirt like I did, or if you think I should have just minded my own business and let the lawyers handle it. Tell me your stories in the comments, because honestly, I think we're all a lot closer to the edge of the zone than we realize.